Today, we're going to be looking at the Great Crash and the start of the Great Depression. So, these are Unit 4, Notes number 5. Industries in trouble. The superficial prosperity of the late 1920s covered the weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. So, because it looked like everyone was doing well, making money, buying things, people could not see that there were problems in the economy. So, key basic industries such as railroads, textiles, and steel barely made a profit during the 1920s. Mining and lumber were no longer in high demand. Coal mining was especially hard hit because of new forms of energy like electricity. So, people did not need coal to power their furnaces, they could depend more on other sources of energy. Farmers needed a lift. Perhaps agriculture suffered the most. And usually farming is very, very unstable and it really kind of depends on the weather and the crops. And so you hardly ever see farmers always doing well. Farmers tend to experience lots of hardship. During World War I, farmers planted more and took out more loans for land and equipment to deal with all of the heavy demand that they had. However, after the war, demand fell and crop prices declined. Farmers boosted production in hopes of selling more crops, but what they did was they overproduced, they flooded the market, and that made prices drop even more. Farmers then began to default on loans, and we began to see rural banks fail. So, farmers couldn't pay back the loans that the banks gave them. Banks didn't have money. And if a bank does not have money, it has to close. And that has a long lasting effects in terms of affecting other people who maybe had their money in the bank. And we'll talk more about bank failures later in the notes. Consumers have less money to spend. As farmers' income fell, they bought fewer goods and services. By the late 1920s, Americans were buying less, mainly because of rising prices, stagnant wages, unbalanced distribution of income, and overbuying on credit. Most Americans were living beyond their means with credit, driving up their debt. And so that was part of the reason why it looked like things were doing well, is because people were buying the majority of their stuff on credit. Uneven distribution of income. Between 1920 and 1929, the income of the wealthiest 1% of the population grew by 75%, compared with a 9% increase for Americans as a whole. So the rich got richer and the poor got poor. We had this huge gap in between. This unequal distribution of income meant that most Americans could not fully participate in the economic advances of the 1920s. Many people did not have the money to purchase the flood of goods that factories produced. So Hoover takes the nation. So Herbert Hoover was a Republican. He won the presidential election of 1928. So we see Harding, Coolidge, and now Hoover, all Republican presidents throughout the 1920s. He wanted to continue the years of prosperity. And so he was quoted saying, "We in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." Not knowing that the Great Depression was just around the corner. So let's stop and think. What were the signs that the economy of the 1920s was not doing as well as people thought? Well, big one, you had key industries that were not doing well, like railroads and steel. So if those industries aren't doing well, they're probably starting to limit their employees and make cutbacks. Then we have overspending by people, the overuse of credit. So buying too much, getting themselves in debt. We also see the unequal distribution of income and also farming industry. Farmers are a huge portion of our economy, so if they're not doing well, it's a big signal for everything else. Dreams of riches in the stock market. During the 1920s, the stock market had become the most visible symbol of a prosperous American economy. Investors could buy stock, a share of ownership in a company. Their investment is then tied to the health of the company that they invested in. Throughout most of the 1920s, stock prices rose steadily. People began to engage in speculation, buying stocks on the chance of a quick profit while ignoring the risk. So, normally people invest in the stock market and it's a long term investment. You're investing in a company hoping that they're going to do well. So, your investment is tied to the health of that company. If they do well, you will make more money. If they don't do well and they close, you lose your investment. So, it is a form of gambling, if that kind of makes more sense to you. So during the 1920s, instead of investing for the long term, people began to engage in this speculation, hoping to invest in a company, make money quickly, and pull out their money, which really kind of messes up with the stock market prices. Many people also began buying stocks on margin, paying a small percentage of the stock's price as a down payment and borrowing the rest. And this is where the real issues come because now they're borrowing money from a bank, sometimes putting as little as only 10% down. So all of that money that's invested in the stock market is coming from the banks. With easy money available to investors, the unrestrained buying and selling fueled the market's upward spiral. So as people are investing in these companies, the stock prices are growing, and so it looks like the market is doing well. But again, it's kind of this superficial prosperity because it's only because people are investing. It's not because the company is actually doing well. The stock market crashes. In early September of 1929, stock prices peaked and then fell. Confidence in the stock market started to waver, and some investors quickly sold their stocks and pulled out. So, as people began to sell their stocks, prices would begin to drop even more. And so, what we see is kind of this snowball effect. As prices drop, people panic, sell, prices will drop more people will sell, prices drop more. On October 24th, the market took a plunge. Panic investors unloaded their shares. October 29th became known as Black Tuesday, when the bottom fell out of the market. Shareholders frantically tried to sell before prices plunged even lower. People who had bought stocks on credit were stuck with huge debts as prices plummeted, while others lost most of their savings. So here's a quick little graph to kind of show you how the stock market was going during the 1920s. We see a steady increase during like 1927, 28, 29, and then we see this huge drop, and that is Black Tuesday. But that is not the worst day of the stock market. It kind of goes up a little bit as people are trying to reinvest, but then it continues to drop and drop and drop, hitting a market low in 1932. So by mid November, investors had lost about $30 billion. The stock market bubble had finally burst. So let's stop and think. What risky practices led to the stock market crash? So, first, speculation, the fact that people were trying to make a quick profit, putting money in, taking it out. It leads to the market being very unstable. And then also buying stocks on margin. So now these people are left with losing their money, but they can't pay the bank back. So we're going to see how that directly affects banks because now it's not really the person that lost money because it was never their money that they invested in the first place. It was the bank's money. And so banks will end up closing as a result. Financial collapse. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, the period from 1929 to 1940 in which the economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. The crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it hastened the collapse of the economy and made it more severe. After the crash, many people panicked and withdrew their money from banks. In 1929, 600 banks had closed. By 1933, 11,000 banks had failed. So while bank failures is one of the huge kind of accelerants with the Great Depression, because while most people didn't lose money in the stock market, any money people had in banks, if your banks closed, that means you lost your life savings, you lost any money you had in the bank, and that directly affects more people. Because the government did not protect or insure bank accounts, millions of people lost their savings accounts. As the economy plunged into a tailspin, millions of workers began to lose their jobs. Causes of the Great Depression. Although historians and economists differ on the main causes, most cite a common set of factors. Tariffs and war debt policies cut down the foreign market for U.S. goods, farming crisis, the availability of easy credit, and the unequal distribution of wealth. These factors led to falling demand for consumer goods. The federal government contributed by keeping interest rates low, allowing companies and individuals to borrow money and build up large debt. In November of 1929, President Hoover encouraged Americans to remain confident about the economy. At this time, the president felt that there tends to be economic slowdowns that happen, but there was nothing to be fearful at this moment. So, the Depression in cities. The Depression brought hardship, homelessness, and hunger to millions. So, as more people lost jobs, we began to see more people becoming homeless, people waiting in line for food, people building these shanty town makeshift homes, and these began popping up all across cities across America. The Depression devastates people. In cities across the country, people lost jobs, were evicted from their homes, and ended up on the streets. Many built makeshift shacks out of scrap materials. Before long, numerous shanty towns were popping up. Soup kitchens offering free or low cost food, and bread lines of people waiting to receive food provided by charities, were seen throughout cities. With falling prices and rising debt, thousands of farmers lost their land. Many farmers turned to tenant farming and barely scraped out a living. The economic difficulties of the Great Depression put severe pressure on family life. Many men had difficulty coping with unemployment because they were used to being able to support their family. And as a result, many families broke apart as men left to try to search for work. So let's stop and think. How did the Great Depression immediately affect Americans? Many Americans either lost money in the stock market crash or with banks closing. We began to see people losing their jobs, and those people that could not continue to live in their homes were often evicted, would become homeless as a result. So at this time, it's also important to remember that there were no safety nets, there was no unemployment, workers' compensation, anything to help these people out during this time period. Like today, we have, the stimulus packages and things like that. So the government didn't really do that back then. So make sure to go back and look at your key terms. Next week, we'll talk more about how the Depression begins to affect America and what steps the government takes to try to remedy this.